Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Myslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Ella Bruce, aka Keto Alpha, is an Australian carnivore bodybuilder, high-protein advocate, founder of KetoAlpha.net, and moderator of the Ketogenic Bodybuilding Facebook group. Most importantly, Ella openly shares and helps people with her deep thinking on nutrition and chemistry across Twitter, Facebook, and the rest of the internet. Welcome to the show, Ella.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. How you doing?
Yeah, very excited to chat with you. I've been anticipating this conversation for a while, following your posts, searching through your posts, reading your analyses of some of these concepts. I think you have really interesting takes on a lot of the science, and also, you walk the walk around bodybuilding and eating keto and carnivore. So excited to dive into some of those topics with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually really interesting. I said the same thing to Sean when I spoke to him not too long ago, but your podcast is actually one of the first ones that I was getting into when I was trying to find some, I suppose, authoritative information about carnivore, or at least a very, very low carb ketogenic diet, a kind of approach, like low fiber, I suppose you could say. So it's actually really interesting to then eventually come back on as a guest with you. It's kind of like coming full circle in some ways.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
So what got you into carnivore, keto, and maybe what had you tried before?
I'm sure everyone says this, but I have literally tried everything. So I've been a bodybuilder for like 10 years. I started out doing, a typical bodybuilding diet where it's like, man, I remember my coach at the time changing macros from things like, I'd have, rather than 181 grams of carbohydrate, I have 167, like as if like the 167, like that's awfully specific.
Yeah.
I don't know about anyone else who can actually hit that, but good for you. 6 meals a day, like hours of cardio, that kind of thing. I've done low fat keto. I've done high fat keto. I've done like a modified Atkins, where it's just like target protein, like the higher protein Atkins style stuff. God, I've even done super high carb. Actually, I did the potato hack too, just for funsies, not too long ago, probably about 5 or 6 months. So I've kind of like experienced, I'd like to think, the gamut of diets. The only one I haven't really gotten much into is a vegan approach. I've tried vegetarian. I just got like mad meat cravings. Like I'm not going to fight it. I hated veganism, so I didn't stick with it. So I can't really talk too much about that one. But how I got into carnivore was actually a bit of a roundabout thing. So I'd heard some things about it from Bitcoin entrepreneurs. Funny enough, it appeared in an article, and I started deep diving into it and kind of just like palmed it off as retarded. I'm like, this is so stupid. And I think that's kind of like everyone's first reaction, really. Let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
Because you're so indoctrinated. It's like, well, how do you poop without fiber? Like, guys, like, come on. I then had some clients who were kind of intrigued and asking me about it as well. And I like to turn around and say that, I don't want to badmouth something unless I physically tried it. And I do try to live by that as well. But the honest truth of it is that I was fascinated by it. It really caught my imagination. And I'm not even really sure why. I guess I loved meat. The idea that I could eat as much of it as I wanted and get lean sounded really, really cool. I had an eating disorder anyway. I didn't really want to admit it at the time, but as I've kind of come through and I've healed through that, I'm more and more comfortable admitting that the way that I was thinking about food was very, very disordered. So I'm the first to admit I actually approached carnivore from a disordered standpoint. And I highlight that specifically because a lot of people talk about carnivore as an eating disorder. Like they're like, you're orthorexic, you're afraid of food. That's why you only eat, a monogroup diet. And the funny thing is, for so many people following this style of eating, it's actually cured my eating disorder. And I don't want to deep dive into that, though. If that's what you want to talk about, I'm more than happy to as well. But I've actually found that it's broken my fear of food. So things that when I was purely ketogenic, I'm like, oh God, I can't have a potato. Like I will literally keel over and die. Is now I'm like, oh yeah, sweet. Okay, I'm gonna feel really crappy tomorrow when I do it, but I'm not gonna die if I have a potato. I'm not gonna get fat overnight. So, it's kind of like in some ways loosened a lot of those eating disordered thoughts and behaviors that I'd had. But I suppose the real reason I've stuck with it is because it's worked for me. And we can talk about high fat versus low fat, and this just seems to be this like constant battle about it. And we can get into that, and I'm sure we will. But the truth is, I can stick to this diet effortlessly. Yeah. I don't think about food ever. I have a whole bunch of food in my fridge. I think I have a little bit of basil. I think that's the only greenery in my fridge at the moment. It just simplifies my life. Like I come home from like a dance or a gym class or like whatever, right? And I grab a random piece of meat out of my fridge and I cook up about a pound of it and I eat. And if I get hungry later, I eat another one, and because of that, I can stick to it. It works with my own individual psychology. I like the food. And at the end of the day, adherence is king. If you can stick to a diet and you can be consistent over a period of time, you will achieve a result. From there, it's really just about tweaking what you're doing to get the result you're after. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's huge. And I can definitely relate to the changing relationship with food and the way that just eating meat can almost it is really hard to explain to someone. They saying, don't you crave other foods? Isn't that so restrictive? Doesn't it require so much discipline? But it's almost really hard to put into words the way it changes your relationship with food for the better, which sounds crazy to someone hearing, you can only eat one type of food.
Well, I mean, okay. So for example, I went out on a date not too recently and they were talking about how hangry they were. They're like, I'm getting low blood sugar, and they're like going backwards and forth about like, oh, I don't know if I want a burger or if I want one, whatever. And I'm sitting there going like, oh, look, I can eat whatever. We can go anywhere and I can find something. Like, you want sushi, I can grab sashimi. You want burgers, I can just grab patties. Like I'm sorted. Yeah. Right. And it was so interesting watching this person who had quote unquote healthy eating patterns, right? And they're just like, what they're going to eat is taking up so many cycles in their brain. I'm just sitting there really chill about it. I'm like, yeah, cool. We can go wherever the hell you feel like, I can make this work. And don't get me wrong. I think by that stage, and this wasn't on purpose, I just hadn't eaten that day. I'm kind of like trimming up at the moment. So I kind of am in that headspace where I'm just kind of embracing my body wanting a little bit of extra energy, just knowing that I'm in a deficit. So don't get me wrong, like I was ready to eat, but I was also really chill about it. And I think that kind of comparison between someone who is almost ruled by food, despite the fact that they claim that they are freed from it because they have all of these options, versus someone who is actually freed from, over concentration on food, despite the fact they probably only can eat one or two different things. That there's freedom and simplicity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I go back and forth on this because one thing I struggle with is thinking about it in terms of like food sensitivity and resilience. You know, by being carnivore, in a sense, are we almost just becoming more fragile? Because it's almost like one of the upsides to, especially in like the bodybuilding world, that people talk about with having this like if it fits your macros type approach, or even a more intuitive eating or auto-regulated eating type approach where you're including a lot of other foods, is you can go anywhere. And yeah, you're always going to feel like crap eating like a piece of cake or something, but you almost don't notice it as much as when you've been carnivore for a really long time and then you have something like that. How do you think about that kind of trade-off of, you know, being really satisfied with your food and feeling awesome eating meat all the time, but almost like, are we becoming anti-fragile in a way?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to put this in like, I suppose, a technical perspective. So I work within IT for the Army within signals. So, I mean, I'd kind of like put this down to, it's like a comparison between the signal noise ratio of what you're hearing from your body versus like are the symptoms louder because there isn't anything to compare it against. So, you know, okay, I'll take a half step back. I do experience greater reactions to food subjectively than what I did before carnivore. So if I was to eat a piece of bread that was high in gluten, like all bread, I suppose, I will absolutely know I've messed up. You know, my stomach tells me I feel like crap for days, right? The question is, what you're really asking is, am I now more sensitive to it? Or is the signal to noise ratio, i.e. how much I'm noticing it versus the background noise of how my body is feeling, is changed? You know, do I notice it more because it's worse, or do I notice it more because I don't have the background noise drowning it out?
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone can give an honest answer to that. I can tell you that from my perspective, I think it's probably a mixture of both. I do think I am more fragile now to eating foods that my body doesn't particularly want me to eat. But that in itself is kind of the point, isn't it? You know, like if I'm not really meant to be eating it, but I can get away with it in survival situations, and, you know, we've manufactured it in such a way that it tastes nice, then, you know, should I really be eating that? Really?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like, have you ever tried a wheat seed before?
No, luckily I haven't.
I've tried one, and honestly, they're like, they actually have like this weird, like acrid bitter taste. And there is no fucking way, unless I was starving, I would go out of my way to start like picking tiny little grass seeds and eating these disgusting little crunchy things to try and survive, unless I absolutely needed to, right? But we go through and we refine it. We take out the endosperm and the rest of the things that taste terrible. We then, you know, bake it with a yeast that makes it smell and taste delicious with some salt and everything else. And like, of course, we're making a food that our body doesn't actually want to eat, that tastes terrible, actually tastes really good. You know, I don't know. To me, it just makes sense to avoid it.
Yeah. I'm with you. I just wanted to think through it, because I debate myself on topics like this sometimes and try to keep an open mind about all of it. And I really want to get into some of these particular topics. But I think what would be great to start with as kind of a baseline for listeners, you have this really interesting theory and explanation around energy density and energy intake, which I think goes a bit beyond Ted Naiman's model of protein to energy ratio in foods. Do you want to just start by explaining that to folks? Because I think it could help a lot of people, and it's especially relevant for people with physique goals and who don't want to feel like they're constantly restricting themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose, like, for people who don't know Ted Naiman's work on protein to energy ratio in particular, and he does a lot of things. We don't want to just call him the P to E guy, but anyway, so for the baseline for Ted with his protein energy ratio, what he's talking about is how much energy of the food is coming from protein and how much is coming from the carbon bond energy of the food being fat and carbohydrates, right? Now that's kind of like a qualitative measure. So we're talking about not absolute amounts of energy consumed. We're just like how much of the energy is also coming with protein. You know what I mean? It's a ratio.
Yeah.
But the truth is that, you know, we don't eat foods in ratios. Like it's a really cool concept to understand a relationship about how good a food might be or not be for you, but it doesn't really tell you too much about what your body's going to do, right? Yeah. Instead, rather than thinking about it in terms of like a gradient or I suppose a line on an arc, it's actually much easier to kind of conceive it as a vector. You know, how much protein have I gained versus how much energy in total for all of the foods, right? And what ends up happening is not only are we now discussing the angle of the line, but we're also actually talking about how long is the vector in general. So to give you an example, the protein to energy ratio of an egg versus a fatty piece of steak is the exact same, right? So in theory, we should be able to just turn around and say, well, you know, so eggs and steak are interchangeable, but 100 grams of steak has much, much more energy and protein than 100 grams of eggs. So they're not equal. You know, 100 grams of steak will have a different effect on your body than having 100 grams of eggs. And that's kind of the baseline of what the concept is. Now, I'm actually going through and writing a book about it at the moment. And by saying I'm writing a book about it at the moment, I mean I haven't touched it in a month and a half because I am lazy. It's like having a child. Everyone says that writing a book is easy until you start to do it. Then you realize like, oh, wow, it's pretty intense. So as a general concept, I would consider that the protein density of the food really controls your change in mass. Sorry, I'll go the other way. The energy density of your food controls essentially your change in mass. So if you're eating very low energy density foods, which in like a carnivore concept is low fat meats, then generally we would expect a decrease in total mass. Because again, you're eating less energy, we expect that you would lose mass to compensate. If you eat higher energy density, then obviously you will gain mass. Similarly, the protein density of the food largely dictates where that mass is allocated. So if you're eating foods that are very high in protein as a ratio, then generally speaking, we'd expect that either you would gain lean mass or you would better retain it in a deficit. And obviously the opposite would be true. And when you start looking at like these as vectors, you can then start working out which foods are going to support your goal. You know, to gain mass, to lose mass, to gain lean body mass, to lose fat mass specifically, you can plot these foods out and you can see exactly what effect they're going to have. So that's, in a nutshell, how the system works.
Yeah. And where does weight of food tie into that?
So there's a lot of research into energy density looked at how much food per day that we eat. And, you know, do we compensate? So if we reduce our energy intake or reduce our energy density in one meal, do we compensate in another meal? And essentially the research around says that we eat approximately the same amount of weight of food per day, regardless of what's in it. Now, low energy density foods, we do compensate a small amount, but not enough to make up the energy difference. And if we eat high energy density foods, we don't undercompensate. So we don't eat less. We end up eating more energy. The research actually says that if we restrict foods so people can only choose low energy density foods, then obviously they can't compensate and they're in an energy deficit and they lose weight. But in free living humans, what ends up happening is people eat the low energy density foods that take up a lot of room in their stomach, and then they compensate at later meals by eating chocolate or higher energy density foods. You know, their body's telling them, I need energy, and they do that. So the trick essentially, I suppose, to using energy density as a metric for energy intake is that you need to decide that I only eat foods within a certain energy density window. Right. So if I know that I eat 2 kilos of food per day and I need to eat 2,000 calories just to make the math nice, then I know I need to eat foods that are about 100 calories per 100 grams.
Right.
And if I do that, then I'll eat approximately 2,000 calories on average every day. If I want to eat 3,000, then my target would be 150 calories plus or minus a little bit per 100 grams. The thing is, if I'm not strict with that, I will compensate and I'll end up overeating energy. I'll overeat. I'll eat foods higher in energy density later to compensate for the energy density difference, which means essentially just because you had a salad with lunch doesn't mean that you can then go and have a treat at dinner.
Yeah, the chocolate will more than make up for the calories from, or the ice cream from the salads you had.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose that kind of targets both sides. You know, vegans turn around and say that, oh, well, we have very low energy density diets, therefore, you know, research supports us. And then you've got carnivores and pretty much everyone else on the other side of the fence around saying, well, actually, this doesn't seem to work. And the truth is because you need to stop yourself from compensating. That's the only way it'll work.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And I know that you have participated. I'm a huge fan of Marty Kendall in his groups, Optimizing Nutrition, the Nutrient Optimizer. And there are folks in there, super smart folks who help a lot of people and help them focus on getting more nutrient-dense foods and lower energy density foods in their diet. So I'm wondering with this theory, why wouldn't this support eating, kilograms worth of things like strawberries and cucumbers and maybe even like Greek yogurt, as opposed to a carnivorous diet with something like leaner meats, or can it kind of work both ways?
That's actually a really good question. So let's put it out here. If you are going to do a mono diet of strawberries, you will lose weight. 100%. There is no way that you could eat, 2 kilos of strawberries per day is like what, 600 calories? 700 maybe? I don't know. There is no way that I can support my energy needs eating pure berries. I spoke before about the potato hack. The potato hack works because you're eating a super high satiating food. That means that you're in a huge energy deficit because you just can't eat enough food to maintain your weight. And funny enough, because I'm in a huge deficit, you end up being in ketosis just because you're eating nothing but, even though you're eating nothing but carbohydrates. So the fact is, like, those approaches can and do work. I suppose the second part of your question, though, is like, why would you choose one over, for example, a lower fat carnivore approach? Well, again, the amount and quality of protein in some of those super low energy density approaches is very poor. The lowest energy density that I can get to in a meat product is 67 calories per 100 grams, and that occurs in shrimp, boiled shrimp. The lowest I can get on a plant-based approach is, 10 or even 7, 8 calories per 100 grams in some of these super high fiber foods, right? So any kind of diet that is skewed specifically towards energy density is automatically going to favor those foods. You know what I mean? We just can't derive much nutrition from them. We can talk about the micronutrition from those foods, but it's great that they're higher in these nutrients, but we have no idea really how much we're actually absorbing from it. Let's be honest.
Right.
We can say that we absorb heat from meat, but again, we don't really know. So let's not get into that argument. So you're really asking yourself, which of these two approaches that can I stick to? Because again, adherence is king. Which is going to have the greatest effect in terms of body composition? Am I going to retain lean body mass eating nothing but strawberries, or am I going to lose it? What about with meat? Am I going to retain more lean body mass, or am I going to lose it? Which one's going to make you feel the best? Am I going to feel best eating, a huge deficit from chicken breast, or am I going to feel better eating a huge deficit of cucumber? And I suppose the last part of it is that I actually really don't think any kind of mono diet is ideal. And by mono diet, I don't mean like I only eat meat or I only eat plants. I mean any mono diet where I'm like, I eat potato or I eat strawberry or I eat flesh meat only. I can't, this is a whole nother argument talking about, do we really need, nose to tail? Do we really need organs? Again, I don't think anyone really knows for sure. I think it would be silly not to hedge your bets because, you know what? If it does nothing for me and in 30 years I still feel great, no worries. But it'd really suck if in 30 years I'm sitting here going, damn, I wish I had some liver, So I guess the final come back to that is that those approaches can work. They do work. They will result in a result. I think you're going to get better body composition results by having a higher protein approach. I also think your subjective experience and ability to stick to the diet will be much higher on a carnivorous approach. That said, if you just want to chug protein shakes and eat nothing but strawberries, then, have at it. Let me know how you go.
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you. I'm just thinking from like a purely aesthetic and bodybuilding perspective, someone might say, eating lean meat all the time is one way. But if something like potato is also very high satiety, and it's easy for you to get some carbohydrate that way to perform, why not have lean meat and completely plain potatoes, or lean meat and strawberries?
Why not indeed?
And Greek yogurt.
Seriously. Yeah, why not? Well, Greek yogurt. So this is a bit of a slightly different topic, but Greek yogurt's really good because it is a low energy density food. But what's interesting about it is that low energy density only occurs because of the water content of it. It's a liquid.
Right.
And what we actually have found out from the research is that the water weight of a food does not correlate with satiety. So people intuitively know this, don't drink your calories. But what the research is essentially saying is that, like, if you were to eat an equal amount of calories from, say, Greek yogurt in compared to cottage cheese, the cottage cheese will be much, much, much more filling, even though you've technically eaten a lower volume of it, simply because the water weight of the yogurt doesn't actually contribute to the satiety. And because the Greek yogurt, the cottage cheese is quite low in water, it exerts a higher satiety effect. So I just thought that was really interesting to bring up just there.
Oh, that is interesting, because I had the same question around things like, strawberries, cucumbers, even meat. Isn't a lot of it water, and isn't that what's making it relatively low energy density? Besides the fact that for meat, at least it's, almost pure protein and no carbs and fats. But isn't there also the fact that there's a lot of water in meat that lowers the energy density too, or is that just much less of a factor?
Well, there is, meat is 70% water, but that's like intracellular water, not extracellular. And that does actually make a difference. You have to break down the actual cell itself in order to withdraw the water from it and a whole bunch of other little things. But just kind of like playing with this topic here, what the research actually find. So to preamble this, everyone says protein is the most satiating macronutrient, right? You hear that so often.
Right.
And I'm about to say this as someone who is a huge advocate for high protein intakes, but I'm going to come out and say it to you. Protein is not satiating in and of itself, right? This actually challenged a lot of my biases when I read the research on this, and unfortunately I had to admit that I was wrong. But protein is in itself not satiating. What it is actually is that it's a weight of food absent of fat or carbohydrates that drive satiety. Now, it just so happens foods that are low in water, fat, and carbohydrates, but also take up lots of space, either are high in fiber or high in protein. So functionally, higher protein foods are more satiating, but it's not actually the protein that's driving satiety. It's the lack of fat or carbohydrates per unit of food that is driving satiety. And there's some really interesting things that kind of come out of this when you, I suppose, internalize this belief, because people talk about like, target protein, you'll lose weight, but yet people are eating like, protein sludge and either, huge quantities of protein. And I've done this, all right? Anyone who's followed me knows that like I've clocked days of like 5, 6, 650, almost 700 grams of protein in a day.
Wow.
Big intakes, playing with protein overfeeding, right? And I'm 72.5 kilos in female. So it's not like I'm, 120 kilos worth of muscle bound dude either. And people eat that amount and they're realizing that, you know what, when I'm targeting protein, I'm not full. Like I can keep eating. And the reason being is because it's not the protein that's driving satiety. It's the lack of fat or carbohydrates that are doing it. So, I suppose my advice to a lot of people who are looking to lose weight and they're hearing all of this advice about, target protein, I'd say that is actually good advice in the sense that don't be afraid of protein. Don't try and avoid it because you're worried about how much you're going to blow ketones. But understand that anytime that you're dieting, you fundamentally need to be in the mindset of losing. I need to eat less. And you need to ask yourself, not what can I eat, but ask yourself, what should I not eat to achieve my goals? Not can I have chicken breast, or not can I have more prawns, or not can I have a protein shake? The question is, should I be eating that piece of chocolate? Do I need that piece of fat that's sitting on the outside of my steak? Do I need to go ahead and, have a carb spike because I'm not feeling great right now? So change your mindset. Don't think about what can I have in your diet. Ask yourself, what do I need to take away? Because at the end of the day, a weight loss diet is about taking away.
Yeah. Super interesting. It's so many things I want to dive into there that you said. One was around a low energy density food is either high in protein or high in fiber. But the protein is more filling. Why is that? Is fiber not also very filling in like eating these giant bowls of salad? As long as you're staying away from, the things we talked about, like the chocolate, the dessert, that would make up for the energy density. How is protein more filling than fiber?
Oh, it's not. It's
not.
No, of course not. I mean, at the end of the day, I could eat 2 kilos of spinach made up in a salad with a whole bunch of other little things, right? As long as the energy density is super low. I would probably have trouble eating, even if I was to eat 2 kilos of that, I'd have trouble getting in 500 to 600 calories, in all honesty.
Yeah.
I'd feel like absolute dog crap, but, I'd be in a huge deficit. Whereas it's much easier to eat over 700 calories, even from lean meat. Like, geez, I could eat 700 calories in a single meal and probably could do it again a couple of hours later, eating, chicken breast or something like that. You're trying to just get a pure protein source. So, fiber itself is actually more satiating than protein, but of course it's more satiating. You're essentially eating something you can't digest. It's like, oh, of course you're going to eat less energy if I eat 2 kilograms of dirt.
Yeah, you can't convert it. It's like eating paper or cardboard.
Yeah, well, you can get energy from it. Certain fiber can be digested into short chain fatty acids in your colon. by bacteria, which you can then subsequently get a small amount of energy from, but it's really, really small. And again, it's subjective experience. You know, that's great that you ate 700 calories that day because you just ate salad, but what are you going to eat tomorrow?
Yeah. Because
I don't know about you, but if I eat 2 kilos of salad, I'm on the toilet for like the whole day, not feeling good. So are you going to be able to stick to that for 2 months or the 3 months it takes you to drop those few kilos that you want to? Probably not.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It all comes back to adherence. And I'm wondering if this gets the answer of another question I had, which was Menno Henselmans recently had this interesting article talking about how past a certain point, you know, protein is not any more satiating than, you know, carbohydrates on a per calorie basis. You know, once you get to this protein leverage threshold, if you will. And a lot of Ted Naiman's work, I think he's excellent. I think he's absolutely brilliant.
Me too.
But a lot of his work is extrapolating, you know, people moving from 10% protein to 15% protein diets. I don't have the numbers exact, but, you know, when we're talking about carnivores, you know, high protein is probably something more like 50% or more of your calories from protein. So there it's a totally different ball game, and it's almost hard to extrapolate, you know, someone on a terrible diet deficient in protein moving to adequate protein or high protein versus someone already high in protein eating more. And I'm wondering what you thought of that article from Menno, if you think protein becomes less satiating past a certain level.
So Menno is a very smart guy. I don't agree with him on a lot of things in general, but I am generally fairly impressed by a lot of his articles when he does write. The thing with Menno in this particular article is that back in 2008, he wrote a piece about why you should never eat more than, I think it was like 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of lean body mass.
Yep.
And unfortunately, he's kind of been stuck on, like, he wrote one piece one time, you know, 12 years ago, and he's been unwilling to change his opinion ever since. And you know, like, if that's the ditch he wants to die in, okay, go for it. Personally, I'm more than willing to change my opinion if I'm proven wrong. So with that out of the way and not, you know, making a straw man of him too much, he's generally correct. You know, beyond a certain point, protein isn't any more satiating than carbohydrates. In terms of like net energy intake at any particular meal, and, you know, how they measured that in the study that he referenced. But I suppose the part that's really worthwhile highlighting in this is that there is a lot more to the outcome of a diet than how subjectively hungry I feel, you know, a few hours after eating. Similarly, you know, Ted with his extrapolations, you know, a lot of his work is based on Simpson and Raubenheimer, two Aussie scientists in Sydney who looked at the protein leverage hypothesis. And, you know, again, you're right, Ted's extrapolated a lot from that. But, you know, experimentally, we do actually know a higher protein approach almost always results in favorable body composition changes. You know, I'm familiar of a number of studies that are like 3.3, 4.4 grams per kilogram, and they all show favorable body composition improvements every time. So, you know, like, that is a consideration. But being a realist and coming right back down to it again, beyond a certain point, he's correct. You know, you will, once your body has hit its physiological need for protein, it no longer exerts a protein drive for you. You no longer feel that craving to eat meat. And in which case you can kind of just allocate your energy to whichever way you feel best. You know, do you feel best on eating a huge amount of protein? In which case, go get your energy needs from that. You know, that will have an effect on your body composition. You know, do you feel best if you want to just go out and eat nothing but a glucose source with a little bit of fat, or do you just want to eat a super high fat keto approach and go get the rest of your calories from fat? It doesn't make a huge difference. not enough that I would say that, no, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of taking the middle of the road. I don't want to make enemies kind of approach here. It's like, well, once you've hit your physiological needs for salt, for protein, for saturated fats, and everything else, your minimums have been taken care of, you've really just got a discretionary fund that you can spend from there. Which way do you want to spend it? Which way do you feel best to?
Yeah, that's a really good answer and a very thoughtful one. And I appreciate you not, just demonizing Menno, and tearing apart his argument, because he does make some very valid points, and he is very thoughtful, about all these topics. And I guess that naturally ties Ella into, so we can all meet our protein one way. And then past that, we can choose to get, like you said, more of our energy from fat, higher fat keto, more of our energy from vegetables, from fruits, from, some people choose grains, whatever. Why do you personally choose to, double down on the protein past, a gram per pound of body weight, or call it even a little bit more? Why do you choose to go even more leaning into, protein itself, rather than having, for your goals, something else, even if it would be one of these really low energy density foods, like, filling your stomach with fiber or vegetables, or filling it with something like potato or strawberries?
Sure. So, I've already touched on the adherence before, so I'm going to skip over that part. I like the diet, so I can do it, right? But
yeah,
I suppose the path for me getting into the super high protein approach actually started from two sources. The first was, I found some work by Antonio et al. A few years ago talking about, some super high protein approaches. And then I ended up going down that rabbit hole, and I found a whole bunch more that, like data points that supported it. And actually I made a graphic that, if you remind me, I'll send to you to share with your viewers later, and they can kind of see like all the body composition changes for all of these protein overfeeding studies.
Yeah.
But, essentially what I noticed is that there was not quite a linear, but there is a definite relationship between a higher protein approach, when calories are equated, and a better body composition outcome, right? So like there was always that understanding sitting in the back of my brain. But the second part was actually having done protein sparing modified fasts, and I got really curious, having done these approaches where I was eating literally just like super lean meat, like boiled chicken and shrimp, right? And losing bulk amount of weight. I started asking myself, like, well, what would happen if I was to try and do this in a surplus, right? Deep dived a whole bunch of research, found that there wasn't really anything that really, really targeted it or answered the questions that I had about it. So I started doing it. I tried to see what would happen if I overate protein. I ended up naming it protein overfeeding as an approach. I went through that for probably 4 or 5 months, actually, playing with it, starting out originally just doing a protein overfeeding day once a week, like a carb refeed, getting all the way up to the point where I'd try and do it as much as I could. What was really interesting is that I grew like a weed. I did gain a little bit of fat, but that only really occurred on the days that I was lazy and I ate higher fat foods with the huge amounts of protein as well. And it made sense that, those higher fat foods would, of course, get stored if I'm in an energy surplus.
Right. And when you say grew like a weed, you mean muscle, just to clarify.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Again, I can show you that. I'll share some photos for your viewership so they can have a look. But I got big, vascular, and like really, really just, I don't know. It's hard to describe. I was almost like constantly full. I felt like I was a balloon that was being pumped up. I felt really hot. I was energetic. I constantly wanted to do things. honestly, I found that going up that high, I hated the diet because it just like eating nothing but egg whites, chicken, kangaroo, all of these kind of things exclusively. Like it's not a particularly not a particularly satisfying diet. But in terms of body composition, the results that I had were phenomenal. Nothing I've ever seen before. I actually had a client who I prepped for a show. She actually won her card, but rather than doing a CKD approach, she prepped carnivorously and was doing protein overfeeding once a week as like a refeed or like a caloric increase. And that worked outstandingly for her as well. So that was kind of like the basis for it. I tried eating super lean, high protein in a deficit, and then I tried to see what would happen if I did it in a surplus. And I found that it was a trade-off between how much I enjoyed the diet, again, adherence, versus the results that I was getting. The more suckier the diet, the better the results. But at the same time, the suckier the diet, the harder it was to stick to. And now it's kind of just been a case of dialing it back, adding fat back in. So I get to a point where
sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, and now it's kind of like at that point where I'm kind of like dialing it back to find that comfy middle ground between what I enjoy doing every day and what is best for my body composition. You know what I mean? Like that intersectional point where I feel good and I'm getting great results and I'm happy.
Yeah. So where have you landed after all this? Like, what does kind of a day of eating look like for you, and how does it vary when your goals are shifting?
Yeah. So I eat about the same every day. It really depends. Sometimes, like at the moment, I found that my hunger hasn't been very high, so I'm probably eating about 3 to 4 pounds. Sometimes when I'm in a high training cycle and my hunger's right up, I'm eating 4 to 5. I just finished leaning up a little bit after Christmas. I wanted to get my ab veins back, so I had been eating like 95, 97% lean beef, kangaroo, chicken breast. I make homemade sausages out of like really, really lean meats. Just things like that. I include things like berries and stuff like that, just because I eat, I suppose what I'd say is an ancestrally appropriate diet. I think, a small amount of berries isn't going to kill you, and I like them, so why not? So that's kind of like the approach that I would take when I'm trying to trim up. Now I'm at a point where I'm actually really quite happy with my body composition. I've got ab veins without them being like obnoxious and, showy. So I started adding fat back in. The way I do that isn't really a measured approach, only because I don't want to get into this mindset where I'm like constantly thinking about food and, making life too hard for myself. So what I do,
tracking meticulously.
Yeah, exactly. It's so tiring. I just don't have time for that shit. What I do is I actually start eating the same foods, but I add fat back in. So like if I'm eating really lean meats, I might add some eggs back in. I might then add some cheese occasionally, little bits and pieces like that. And then I might start trading out one meal where I was eating chicken. I was like, okay, cool. Now I'm going to eat some 90-10 beef, or I'm going to have like a steak and I'm not going to cut the fat off the top, or, just things like that. And then I kind of just test and adjust. So if I'm still kind of feeling like I'm in a deficit, that feeling where you kind of just like, you're a little bit run down, you're a little bit tired, you don't have enough energy, then, I might add another meal in that's a little bit fattier. So I kind of just play with it from there. I tend to go by visual changes or like measurement changes and just like subjective feeling. So if I'm losing and I don't want to, I just, add a meal in that I'm a little bit fattier than what I had been eating.
Yeah, and I know, Ella, when you were on HBO, you were talking about Sean Baker's podcast, you were talking about eating higher fat and trying to put on weight and being amazed at how hard it was to actually put on weight eating really fatty. And then I know you even went higher fat than that and got up to like PKD level ratios. Can you talk about like what happened with that? And one of the things I seen your results on Twitter, but I had another question, which was you mentioned on HPO that you felt like you were getting stronger and stronger while doing that too. How did you feel? You can tell folks what resulted body composition wise, but also how did you feel and how did your performance change?
Yeah. Okay. So by the HPO podcast, I'd only really just started playing with like the PKD levels. So by that stage, there was definitely coming to a point when my body just didn't want any more energy. I just didn't want to eat anymore. And like the idea of continuing to keep eating was making me feel disgusting. Keep in mind though that, that's the same feeling I get anytime I'm in a surplus. It wasn't necessarily unique on being in a surplus on high fat. It was also just the fact that I was in a surplus, because I also experienced that when I'm in a surplus on protein. Like it just becomes a job to eat. And any bodybuilder, anyone who's been in a consistent surplus for a long period of time will actually tell you that it's almost harder to consistently overeat than it is to consistently undereat. So I definitely did experience that. I think that if I was overweight already and I was to follow that approach, and I say think only because I can't say it because I've never done this whilst being overweight, but I would hazard a guess and turn around to say that if I wasn't specifically trying to overeat and I was already overweight, I probably would have lost weight following that approach. But for someone who was already very lean, moving into a higher fat approach made me put on fat. And I think a lot of people have had that experience. What was interesting was that I gained strength really, really quickly. I don't actually know how much of that was because I was in a surplus and how much was because of my dietary choices. I think they're probably interrelated. I dare say that having a higher saturated fat intake meant that hormone production was optimized based on what my body needed. There was sufficient building blocks from the protein and from the saturated fats to create new cells. I wasn't working, so stress was really low. I had perfect control over, like I was on holidays at the time. I had perfect control over my eating schedule, my sleeping, my stress, everything, right? So it was kind of like a perfect storm. That kind of changed a little bit when I dropped the protein right down. I couldn't actually do that carnivorously. So I ended up adding in some, like, I suppose, ketogenic foods, which were obviously a lot higher in polyunsaturated fatty acids as opposed to just what you would get from meat being saturated specifically. I found that when I did that, I was very, very much able to overeat. I don't know about you, but I could probably put around 3,000 calories of almond butter away in a single go. No problem.
Yeah.
I found chicken fat specifically to be less satiating than ruminant fat. And again, polyunsaturated versus saturated fats, I think, is probably a contributing factor. The wall that I hit with a 1-to-1 ratio, which is what I was eating for high fat carnivore, so about 70% of calories from fat, completely disappeared when I dropped my protein right down. There's a bit of a confound because I included some non-meat products to get the fat right up, only because I didn't really feel like just eating pure rendered animal fat. I'm sorry. So I found once I went through that threshold, the resistance of my hunger to tell me to stop eating pretty much disappeared and it became free reign. I didn't really get protein cravings like I would if I was eating just a traditional low protein approach. I don't really know what that's about. But gym performance did decrease as well. Sleep was still fine, stress was still fine, but yeah, I stopped gaining strength as quickly as what I was. Again, just being intellectually honest with everyone. I don't know if that's because, I've been doing the training program for like 4 or 5 weeks and I was coming up to a deload and I needed a rest, or if it was the change in the diet, but I did notice a change.
And how low was your protein getting?
In the end, I was almost trying to avoid protein, just because, like, naturally I gravitate towards a super high protein approach. So I'd have to, again, and I don't count calories and I don't count macros. So I can't give you an exact figure, but, like, it was getting to the point where I was chasing down like pork crackle or, rather than having like a steak, I'd bake myself a pork knuckle or, just things like that where I was trying to eat like as fatty as I could do. So it was almost hard for me to try and I had to avoid the higher protein foods just because I naturally gravitated towards them.
Yeah. It actually is really hard to hit those types of ratios. I've tried to do it before. You have to eat some really weird meals to get your fat that high and your protein low enough.
Yeah, I also discovered that I'm not a big fan of lamb's brains. So, I mean, that happened.
That's an interesting experiment.
Yeah, no, it was, I'm not sure why brains taste fishy, but they do. So,
And Ella, I'm curious on the higher protein type of approach. There's two main downsides people talk about, and I'd love to get into them with you. One is just like having that much protein, you have to go to the bathroom a lot, increases urination, and it like can make it hard to sleep from being so hot and having to pee so much. So is that something you've had to deal with? Or
oh yeah, absolutely. Especially when protein overfeeding.
Okay.
At the moment when I'm kind of just like going with the flow, I'm not really trying to overeat protein, undereat it, overeat fat, whatever. I'm not playing with things. I'm kind of just eating a leaner carnivore approach. I don't have any of those symptoms, but when I do specifically target protein, and again, I talked to you before about why I don't think you should target protein. Yes, I absolutely did have those effects. I was sweaty, like a fast heart rate. I constantly felt like a coiled spring, like I just needed to do something. The sleep wasn't particularly great because I was, again, really energetic. There is definitely urination. And whilst I don't want to get into this whole, what was that thing early last year, the keto crotch?
Yeah.
So stupid.
Yeah, keto crotch, keto rash, all those things.
Oh my God, it's so dumb. But like, again, breaking down all those amino acids, your urine does smell like cat pee. So like maybe if you've got keto crotch, you're probably overeating protein and you should clean up yourself after peeing. But that's a separate topic.
But you're still eating fairly high protein, just to clarify for listeners, right?
Yeah,
like you're still eating 300, 400, maybe even more grams of protein a day, and you're not experiencing those symptoms, you're saying, as long as you don't go up to like the 600, 700 plus territory.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, again, at the moment I'm eating about 3 to 4 pounds. So let's call it 4 pounds, right? That's about 1.6 kilos, which altogether is about 320 to like 350 grams of protein per day, right? It's pretty much what I eat. If I go up to the 5 pounds, it might get up to the 400 gram mark. The only difference is if I'm eating lean meat, those 300 to 400 grams of protein also comes with a whole bunch of fat. Sorry, if I'm eating lean, doesn't come with fat. If I'm eating fattier, it does. That's it.
Right.
So my diet is actually very, very consistent.
Yeah. And that's why it's interesting to see how these changes affect you. And then the second thing people talk about with regards to eating really high protein chronically is elevated blood glucose versus more ketogenic macros. And I think this kind of ties into, I sent you this post that was in World Carnivore Tribe. If we want to open up this can of worms, And it was all about this guy posting about, does protein get converted to glucose if it's in excess of what we need for lean tissue repair and growth? And basically arguing, if you're eating super high protein, it's not necessarily supply driven where the protein turns into chocolate cake. It's demand driven, but he argued that basically you're kind of not keto if you're eating this high protein, because it's just turning into glucose in a slow drip. And there were a lot of, tactical errors in that post, but just curious to hear what you think about, elevated blood glucose from high protein overall, and then separately this kind of argument he makes of it not being a ketogenic diet.
Sure. So, I'll address the article specifically later, because it's almost, that in itself is a whole discussion we can get into. But let's be blatantly obvious. If you overconsume protein beyond what your body needs for cellular repair and turnover, it's going to burn it for energy. That's why it has, that is why when you're overeating it, you've got, all of that energy, and you're sweating and you're raising your body temperature and all of these other things. It's because your body is trying to burn it. And again, through the Randall cycle, where glucose and protein is competing with fatty acids for oxidation based on serum concentrations. If you've got lots of one energy substrate competing with fat, then your body naturally stops burning fat to clear the other substrate, right? That's how it works. So if you are over consuming protein, you're not burning fat. You can claim that it's not ketogenic. And I think that's kind of missing the forest for the trees. Who gives a shit? Sorry to be blunt.
Yeah.
What's the difference between blowing 0.3 and blowing 0.6 if you're still losing the same amount of fat? Did you hang up on me?
No. I was just wondering I was just thinking, does it affect how you feel though? If your ketones are lower, sure. Like if someone were to start carnivore diet from scratch, coming from a high carb diet, do you think that they need to eat lower protein for a time to keto adapt per se? And therefore feel better long term? Or do you think it's fine to just jump, if they like eating that way, just jump straight into high protein, no carb, lower fat?
I think you kind of answered your own question, if that's what they like doing. There is definitely a different feeling between super high protein and low protein ketogenic approaches. They all feel completely different. On a lower protein ketogenic diet, you get that kind of I feel empty, but I'm okay with that kind of feeling. Do you know what it's so hard to describe?
Yeah.
When you're deep in ketosis, where you're just I don't give a shit about food, right? That's one feeling.
Yeah.
The moderate protein approach, I tend to find that, the feeling is a little bit different. Same as when you do the high protein approach, you feel like a clockwork sparrow, like you're constantly doing something. It's almost like manic versus the low protein approach of depressive, if you will. You know what I mean? Like the two ends of that spectrum. So there is a subjective difference. Would I suggest that someone brand new to a low carb approach thinks that the super high protein as the standard, like that's their first experience into it? Absolutely not. If that was my first experience, I probably would have been like, wow, I feel like crap. I don't want to do this. Because it's just so different to what you're used to. Right.
But I'm thinking more from a metabolic standpoint. Do they need to restrict protein for a time to induce ketosis and get fat adapted before switching to high protein? Do you have to go through that ketogenic period in order for the high protein carnivore to work well for you? Or can you, assuming that, you get over the fact that it kind of feels shitty, would it be okay to dive straight into higher protein? Basically, I'm thinking all these people for World Carnivore Month and all these things are starting carnivore for the first time. And a lot of them are eating, 2-3 pounds of meat. So by default, they're doing a much higher protein approach. They're not eating quote unquote ketogenic macros. They're probably not in ketosis often. So do you think they would be better off going through kind of a classic ketogenic diet for a couple weeks to adapt first and then switching over to that? Or does it not really matter in the end? Does it all kind of wash out because you're restricting carbs?
Okay, cool. So, sorry for going off on a tangent. I mean, baseline up front, ketosis is about a difference between acetyl-CoA and oxaloacetate in the Krebs cycle. That's all it is. So if you remove a source of one of those by not eating carbohydrates, you're going to be in ketosis, right? That process, if you've never done it before, is going to suck for you because you're not metabolically flexible enough just yet where that transition can be comfortable. So you're going to feel something, right? We accept that. We know it's normal. Make sure you're getting enough electrolytes so you don't make it worse and kind of just embrace the suck. I'd say for anyone who's coming in from World Carnivore Month, welcome. Secondly, I would target foods that have about a 1-to-1 to 2-to-1 protein to energy ratio. And the reason I target those is because that's probably the sweet spot in terms of getting favorable body composition changes, because let's be honest, most people who start any diet want to lose fat, and that's probably a good starting point, that kind of range. I think that's a good intersectional point where you're not going to have any of the really manic kind of symptoms you expect having super high protein intakes. I don't think people who are, trialing this out for the most part are going to be aspiring elite level athletes or bodybuilders. So, making lifestyle sacrifices and, adherence sacrifices to get a slightly better result maybe isn't a good trade-off for those people, in which, so I kind of feel like that 1-to-1 to 2-to-1 spot is kind of like that nice little middle ground where people will both feel comfortable. They'll get nice results. They'll resolve maybe a lot of these like underlying health or mental health, even attitudes towards food, and have a really positive experience trialing this. I'd give the advice of, yes, eat when hungry, stop when full, but no, don't try and find the fattiest piece of meat that you can find. Don't try and avoid protein, but then don't chase it with a spoon either. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Don't try to force food. Don't try to just... Believe me, your ancestors have been doing this for millions of years. You're cool. Just go with the flow. It'll all work out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think people need to restrict or eat a very particular way to get into ketosis before starting a carnivore diet. And I think that's Sean Baker's message, which is just eat the meat you enjoy until you're full. Keto and all these adaptations will sort themselves out along the way.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really salient point here. This whole discussion and a lot of these points are about, how do I optimize? And optimization is great, but optimization is also the enemy of action. Yes. Very well put. So just start. And then if you're not getting the results that you want to, great, cool. Well, we're here. Let's start testing and adjusting and moving you in the right direction.
Yeah. So let's tear apart that post because I know you're excited to do it.
Let me just reopen it again. Hang on.
Sure.
So for everyone who don't know, there was an article by a gentleman who's, out of politeness, I won't mention his name,
sure.
More or less going, does protein get converted to glucose in excess of what we need for lean tissue repair and growth? Right. And he asked a couple of questions up front, like who cares if it does? And if we think it doesn't, what ends up happening to the extra? Really interestingly, the research article that he uses to support his hypothesis, which is that we shouldn't be consuming protein or extra protein because of what it does with glucose. He actually references a study by Antonio et al., where he looked at protein intakes as high as 4.4 grams per kilogram of lean body mass, right? So that is 2 grams per pound and is considered very, very high. It's actually the highest research article that I'm aware of in terms of protein intake. And what's really interesting is in his post, he listed the baseline calories, protein, and body composition for both the control and the experiment group and then made some inferences from it. But what I found, I'm going to say intellectually dishonest, is that he's actually purposefully misrepresented the data. So he's mentioned that the body composition changes went from 14.2% body fat, without getting into the details, you don't have it in front of us. Essentially, he's saying that the control group who are eating some 800 calories less actually gained slightly less fat percentage than the experiment group. What really happened was that the experimental group was eating, they were eating approximately 800 calories per day extra, exclusively from protein, right? So they were eating a lot more food. Everything else was the same. The control group gained 300 grams of fat and 1.3 kilos of muscle, whereas the group that was eating an extra 800 calories per day actually lost 200 grams of fat but gained 1.9 kilograms of muscle. So automatically the data that is represented has specifically omitted the fact that the experimental group who were overeating protein not only gained more muscle, but actually lost fat. That's not represented in the post. And I feel like that was intellectually dishonest right from the get-go. Sorry, one sec. He actually says a little bit later in the post that the positive is that they didn't gain weight eating 800 more calories per day. But again, that's actually not true because both groups actually gained weight.
Body weight, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One gained 1.3 kilos of muscle, the other gained 1.9. Of course. And the people overeating calories actually lost fat, which I found really interesting as well. He then says that the negatives are that they had a worse change in body composition. And, again, I don't know what world you live in, my friend, but anywhere where I gain more muscle and lose more fat is a positive for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to have that outcome.
So he makes a whole bunch. He then writes a whole narrative about a whole bunch of things. He talks about Gabrielle Lyons, who's a great researcher, by the way. He misrepresents her data. He talks about how some people were eating 2,000 calories per day, and how he didn't think that was enough. And I honestly think that, this person has no right in telling people how much energy they should eat per day. And he obviously has no experience in working with athletes or people who are interested in, controlled body composition or changes for competing or things like that. Because 2,000 calories on some of these cuts is almost generous. So I think he's lacking context a little bit in some of those statements. He does actually talk a little bit about finally converting protein into glucose. And I think this is a really interesting topic to quickly touch on too. So he talks about, 61% of protein gets converted to glucose, right? And this is a number that we see thrown around a lot, but it's actually kind of misunderstood. The truth is that if I was to give you a bolus of equal amounts of all 21 amino acids, 61% of that would become glucogenic and 39% would become ketogenic, right? Being that they either break down into a usable glucose substrate or they break down into a ketone acid that we can then subsequently burn for energy, right? But food doesn't exist in an equal bolus of all amino acids. And we know this instinctively. That's why, we know that plant protein sources are less I suppose, useful to the human body than animal protein sources. So saying that, 61% of protein gets turned into glucose is kind of a meaningless statement.
Yeah.
And I think I want to close this off by getting back to his original question of who cares if it does? We can talk about changes in ketone levels. So, over-consuming protein does actually transiently reduce your ketone levels. It does this because protein can convert to a intermediate in the citric acid cycle through a process called anaplerosis. And it means that essentially you can provide an alternate form of oxaloacetate into the cycle. But this is really transient. So if you were to have a glucose source, right, what ends up happening is that glucose gets moved into the liver, it's converted into glycogen, and it's stored. Then when your body needs energy, it slowly trickles out this glucose to provide oxaloacetate into the cycle and provide energy. With protein, it doesn't really work that way. You know, I might provide an alternate source of oxaloacetate and so reduce ketosis for a small period of time, but it's not being stored in the liver to then be suddenly pumped out on demand. As soon as that source is depleted again, you actually just naturally start falling straight back into ketosis. We can see that overeating protein doesn't actually result in a net decrease in ketone levels within the blood. It actually just means that we're burning less of them. You know, again, the Randall cycle, we're providing an alternate form of energy substrate to burn. And once that's gone, we just naturally slide back into what we were doing. Now, I'm being a little bit overly simplistic because I want people to understand this. I really want people to not fear protein because they're worried it'll kick them out of ketosis. It's not going to do that the way that we think about with carbohydrates. It's not going to be like, oh, great, now I need to fast or redeplete my liver glycogen before I can get back into ketosis. That's not what happens. As soon as your body has cleared the protein again, you're straight back into it. There isn't any transitional period.
Right. So if I understand what you're saying, just to make it really simple, I like to think in numbers. Let's say someone's eating like 200 grams of protein and 100 to 150 grams of fat, no carbs. So they're in ketosis. Then you throw 200 extra grams of protein on top of their diet. So they're now eating 400 grams of protein. It may be true that some amount of that 200 grams, you know, call it 120 worth, converts to glucose and is used for energy when your body needs it. But it wouldn't be the same as just dropping 120 grams of carbs in your diet or 120 grams of glucose, because that would knock you out of ketosis, and then you would have to undergo, like, you would have to get back into ketosis more slowly, versus as soon as your body burned through the carbs it needed with the extra protein, you'd be straight back into keto.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget, you know, that extra 80 grams of protein that converted into ketones are also being burnt straight away, you know?
Yeah.
You know, it's not just about like, oh, there's suddenly 60% of this is now glucose. It's like, well, actually 40% of it is now also ketones in your blood that need to be burnt.
Right.
And like, let's do this exact same thought experiment, but we're not adding in an extra 200 grams. Let's just talk about all you're eating is 200 grams of protein and say 100 to 150 grams of fat. So same scenario. Well, let's just say that you're eating this in 2 meals per day, right? You're in keto. You then have this big meat bolus. You have all of this protein that hits you. Pardon me, sorry. And then boom, it kicks you out. Very, very transiently. It doesn't mean anything, but you're actually kicked out for a small period of time. Your body isn't producing new ketones, right? Your serum levels might not decrease, but that's only because you're not burning them. You know, they're still there. You're just burning something else, but you're not making any extras either, right? But as soon as that protein's been cleared and you go back to burning the fats, I suppose, for energy, just again, keeping this really simple, you're back into ketosis. You know, so the amount doesn't really matter. Every time that you have a protein bolus of really any size, you're going to have this effect to some degree. You know, so like is the natural end state of this is that we just don't eat protein? You know what I mean? Like, we're so afraid of like being out of ketosis for a short period of time for some reason that, we start avoiding protein. Like, no, of course not, guys. And let's be realist about it at the end of the time. We know that the body composition improvements does increase almost linearly with an increase in protein up to about 4.4 grams per kilogram. I don't know what happens after that. I'm kind of hesitant to extrapolate. So, even if you want to talk about, even in the worst case scenario, it said, yes, it absolutely does kick you out, even though that's not true. At the end of the day, if you look better naked afterwards, who cares?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the results that matter.
Exactly.
Sean always talks about that, points at the results.
Yeah.
And another topic I wanted to touch on with you, Ella, just briefly is meal frequency. And how much does that matter, or what do you think is optimal given this kind of carnivorous keto approach around intense resistance training like you're doing? Do you need to have the 4 to 6 protein boluses optimally per day? How do you do it personally and time your protein around your workouts? And do you ever work out fasted, or is that something you avoid as well?
Sure. So it really depends, I think, on again, adherence. I'm not going to touch on that. Secondly, whether or not you're gaining or you're losing. So if you are in a gain phase, higher meal frequency experimentally has better end states. So as much as I don't particularly like eating high meal frequencies because I don't like being constantly ruled by food, I do know that if I'm in a gain phase, I need to eat more meals. I normally get up to about 4 per day, and then after that, it's not really worth it for me to try and push into 5 or 6. Yeah. I just don't like doing it. If you're not in a surplus, the research actually shows that as long as you're getting sufficient protein per day, then it doesn't really matter in terms of muscle mass retention. I think if you're very, very lean, that it's not ideal to be having an OMAD, and that's just to do with the fact that, your body can only provide you so much energy per day per kilogram of fat that you have on your body, which means that, if you're very lean, you need to eat more frequently. A lot of people who do fasting have seen this, but, when they were like, 20% body fat per male, they could do 1 meal a day and they felt great. As they got down to like 15, they were noticing that they needed to do like a 16-8. And then as they're getting like sub 10, they're like, wow, fasting actually really sucks. You know what I mean? And it's just because their body can't provide them enough energy. They need to eat more frequently. So it's like that funny little interplay. Personally, what I like to do is if I am cutting, I like to have 2 large, very satisfying meals per day. I try and delay my first meal as long as it feels comfortable, I guess. A little bit of a hunger grumble every now and then is no biggie. Like, I don't really care about that. But you get that kind of like naggy, I need to eat feeling. And that's when I'll make myself, I'll allow myself to have that first big breakfast. And then generally I'll just eat a dinner. If I'm bulking, then I will have approximately 4 meals a day, which is be like breakfast, early lunch, an afternoon, and then a dinner meal. I do train fasted, but that's because I train mostly at 5:30 in the morning. And I'm sorry, but I'm not eating a steak at 5:30 in the morning.
And have you thought about having a beef protein or whey protein shake before you train? Do you think that would be more optimal?
Yeah, it actually is 100% more optimal. Again, the research does support it. There's a lot of articles on the CISSN, or the Journal for International Sports Nutrition, that actually looked at meal timing, protein timing, and things like that. And at the end of the day, the research does actually support having a protein bolus prior to training as being ideal. And I think that largely comes down to having amino acids available in the bloodstream, both to suppress muscle protein breakdown whilst training and it being immediately available post-training. You're already digesting it.
Yeah.
I think the differences that I've noticed personally just kind of make it a bit meh. You know what I mean? I might have an essential amino acid drink rather than whey or a beef protein. But for the most part, the extra hassle versus the results I get out of it is kind of a bit like meh for me. Other people, like, if I was, I'm pretty close to the end of my genetic potential. I can't really gain too much more muscle without jumping on some pretty strong anabolics. But, if I was, and I was doing that to my body, then the trade-off would be worth it. Do you know what I mean? Whereas for me now, it's kind of like meh, I'm pretty happy. That said, I've got athletes who are absolutely trying to find the highest level performance that they can. And we are squeezing every last ounce out of that we can. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. So for them, you would, if you had a client who was training, first thing in the morning, on a keto or carnivorous style approach and wanted to optimize, you would probably advise them to have, some type of protein shake before.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Got it. Well, Ella, we have gone deep on so many things. There were more topics I wanted to cover. Like, I know sometimes you've talked about strategic carb refeeds and TKD and things like that. I would love to do a part 2 at some point, but in the meantime, where can folks find out more about you, follow along, ask you questions, because you have so many great resources, and I really appreciate you coming on today.
Oh, thank you. No, it's been a pleasure. So, if you're not already on Twitter following me, I'm 2 Minute Keto. I manage a number of Facebook groups, including ketogenic bodybuilding, carnivore bodybuilding, nutrient keto, and my latest muse, which is Keto Alpha Alliance on Facebook. That's kind of where I'm giving away my current training plans, my mesocycle, and we're kind of just like a big group. Everyone's all just training together, doing the same thing. So, hey, if you want to know, jump on board and get some training programs with me, please join up. It's always a pleasure to have more people. Otherwise, I'm actually thinking about kicking off a new YouTube channel. Does that count?
Awesome. Please do. Please do.
But yeah, and I'd love to do a part 2 with you as well. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I'll certainly link to all of that in the show notes at carnivorecast.com. And thanks again for your time, Ella. Really appreciate it, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, and you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Carnivore Cast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.